The fingers stopped shaking somewhere around the third mile into Cold Rock Canyon, and Ren Calloway knew that was the dangerous part. Not the shaking, the stopping. 2 years of watching her mother die had taught her things that no 18-year-old should carry among them, the specific vocabulary of a body surrendering to cold. The trembling was muscle involuntary, furious, alive. The stillness that replaced it was something else, something closer to the mountain's own indifference. She kept walking. The canyon walls rose on both sides so high that the sky above had narrowed to a pale strip of fading light, the last of the December sun already gone from the floor where she moved. Cold Rock Canyon did this swallowed illumination early, kept its own hours answered to nothing seasonal or human. The cliffs were dark basalt streaked with pale quartz veins that caught what little light remained and held it briefly like memory holds a face. The stream to her left had gone silent under a shell of ice 2 feet thick. Every surface wore a thin skin of frozen moisture that caught her lantern flame and scattered it in cold sparks across the stone. She had been walking north for 3 weeks. Before that, she had been standing in a kitchen on a Tuesday evening listening to 11 words reshape the entire architecture of her life. The farm sat 60 acres outside Ashburn, a town in the Idaho Territory, that appeared on state maps only because cartographers had a professional obligation to be thorough. Her mother had married Doyle Calloway when Wren was 9, a quiet transaction, practical in the way that most things in that country were practical. Two people combining their separate difficulties into a shared one and calling it a life. The arrangement had its merits. Doyle handled livestock with genuine competence. Her mother handled the house with the efficient love of a woman who had learned early that love expressed itself most honestly through action rather than declaration. Wren handled whatever fell between those two territories, which turned out to be most things. She had not resented this. The work was real, the days had shape, the farm produced enough to sustain 3 people without excessive suffering. Her mother's laugh existed in that house, low and quick, arriving without warning, like a bird landing on a windowsill. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke in winter. The bedroom curtains her mother had sewn from mail-order fabric moved in summer drafts and threw leaf-shaped shadows on the ceiling. These were not small things. Then the cough started in the autumn of 1882, when Wren was 14. Lung disease moved slowly in her mother's body, but its direction was never in question. A strong woman became a shadow over the course of 18 months, not all at once, not dramatically, but in gradual subtractions. The brightness in her eyes on good mornings, the ability to carry the wash basket up the stairs, the capacity to sleep through a full night without the cough waking her, waking Wren, waking whatever hope had gathered in the quiet hours. Wren learned to change bed linens without disturbing the woman beneath them. She learned to cook broth thin enough to swallow without effort. She developed a particular skill for reading weather from the color of the sky, not for her own sake, but for her mother's planning, the week around the days when sitting up and watching the window might be possible. Doyle retreated to the barn. This was not cruelty exactly. Wren spent a long time convincing herself of this, mostly because it was true. He was a man who had not been built for certain kinds of pain, specifically the kind that arrived slowly, that required witnessing, that demanded a particular species of courage most people discovered they did not possess until the moment required it. He loved his wife in the way that strong, silent men love their wives, completely wordlessly, without the equipment necessary to remain present when loving meant watching. So he went to the fields, he went to the barn, he went to anywhere that was not the bedroom where the cough lived. Wren did not blame him for the going. She blamed him for what came after. Her mother died on a cold morning in March 1884. The funeral was small. The silence that followed was enormous. 2 people now orbiting the same kitchen table with nothing between them except the memory of a woman and a property line, and neither of those things was sufficient to generate actual warmth. For nearly 2 years, the arrangement continued by momentum rather than intention. Wren ran the household because she had learned to run it, and because stopping would have meant confronting questions she was not ready to answer about what came next, about what she was owed, about what the future looked like for a girl with no money, no education beyond what a farm and a sick woman had taught her, no family except a man who had never quite figured out how to look at her directly. She patched the roof when autumn storms tore shingles loose. She split firewood because Doyle never split enough. She cooked meals that he ate in silence and left dishes on the table without comment. On a Tuesday evening in November 1886, he looked at his hands and spoke without looking up. His voice was flat, deliberate, the voice of a man who had rehearsed the words enough times to sand them down to their functional minimum. I can't keep supporting you. You're 18, old enough to figure things out. A pause that held exactly the wrong kind of weight. You'll have to find your own way. Ren sat across from him and waited for the rest. The explanation, the apology, the acknowledgement that he was ending something. What arrived instead was silence, and in the silence, something worse than anger. She saw his face shift in a way he wasn't controlling, a subtle rearrangement of tension around his eyes and jaw that she recognized with absolute clarity because she had spent 2 years reading every flicker of expression on a face that could no longer speak plainly. He was relieved. Not cruel relief, not the satisfaction of cruelty accomplished. Just the simple, exhausted relief of a man setting down a weight he had been carrying without the strength for it. The kind that arrives when a long, anticipated difficulty finally begins. She was the difficulty. She watched him not know that she could see it. Ren pushed her chair back from the table and stood. Fine. One word. She walked to her room and closed the door without force, because force would have meant something, and she had decided not to give this moment more of herself than it had already taken. Morning brought her belongings stacked outside the front door, a wool blanket already stiffened by frost. Several changes of clothing folded with a precision that suggested he had done it carefully, as though the folding could substitute for something else. A small cooking pot, the lantern she had kept in her room, $23 in worn bills he had folded inside an envelope with nothing written on it. That was the sum of 18 years. Before she left, she crossed the house and pushed open the door to her mother's room. No one had opened it since the morning of the funeral. Dust had settled on every surface with the patience of time, on the dresser, on the windowsill, on the curtains her mother had sewn. The bed was still made exactly as Ren had made it on that last morning, the quilt drawn up with the particular neatness of someone performing an act of love on a body that no longer required warmth. On the shelf beside the window sat a small notebook covered in cloth that had once been blue, now faded to the color of winter sky. She lifted it without opening it. The cover was worn at the corners from handling. The pages had a slight give when she pressed the cover full dense. With her mother's precise, old-fashioned handwriting, she knew from the one time she had glimpsed a page while setting down a tea tray without being seen. She had not read it then. She did not read it now. She was not ready for whatever was in there. She pressed it into her coat pocket beside the $23 and walked out of the room and out of the house without looking back. By noon, the farm had vanished behind a bend in the road, and she had not yet decided that she was not going to cry. She decided it by supper. Crying required energy, and the cold was already negotiating with her body for resources she could not spare. She walked north for 3 days before she reached Ashburn, carrying the knowledge that vague plans and specific winter rarely reached agreement. She intended to find seasonal work trapping crews, ran through winter logging camps needed cooks and menders. There were ranches that hired through the cold months for people willing to tolerate conditions that drove away more comfortable candidates. She knew how to work. She knew how to keep a stove lit and a wound clean and a fence standing and a sick woman breathing through the night. Surely someone in the Idaho Territory needed those skills badly enough to pay for them. The weather disagreed with the timeline. The first major storm arrived nearly a month ahead of any reasonable expectation, converting trails to traps and roads to white silence. Travel slowed to survival pace. The original plan reached the logging camps before freeze-up became irrelevant. What replaced it was simpler and more immediate: stay alive today. Ashburn presented itself on the morning of her 4th day as a scattering of buildings huddled at the edge of a valley where the Bitterroot Range began to climb in earnest. The kind of place that had boomed briefly during the silver fever of the 1860s contracted when the silver proved disappointing, contracting further when the logging followed the timber south, shrinking now towards something between a town and a memory. A single main street, a church whose paint had surrendered to altitude and weather, a tavern doing the essential work taverns do in dying towns. One general store with a lamp burning in the window that she walked toward because it was the only warmth she could see. Agnes Pruitt stood behind the counter in a posture that belonged to a person who had occupied that exact position for decades, not settled exactly, but rooted as though the counter were an extension of her spine. She was perhaps 60, silver-haired and sharp-faced, wearing a calico dress under a wool shawl that had been mended in 3 places with thread that didn't quite match. Her eyes moved over Ren the way experienced eyes move over a ledger cataloging details before drawing conclusions. Wren set what she wanted on the counter. Salt, dried beans, a tin of matches. Placed the money beside it with the directness of someone who has learned that hesitation looks like guilt even when it isn't. Agnes looked at the money, looked at Wren. You running from something. I'm not running. The distinction felt important enough to make. I was put out. Something moved in Agnes's expression, not softening exactly, but a recalibration. She pushed the money back across the counter with two fingers. Out of my store! Wren picked up the money. She looked at Agnes without making it a confrontation. The older woman's face held something that wasn't hostility, something colder and more considered. Years later, Wren would understand it as the expression of a woman who had watched other girls like her walk into these mountains and not walk back out. Agnes wasn't following a rule. She was looking at a ledger entry she had seen before with a bad outcome, and she was declining to record it again. The understanding did not help in the moment. Wren put the money in her pocket and walked out without another word. She filed the information away the way she filed everything, practically without sentiment, as one data point in an ongoing problem that required continuous revision. She bought a small amount of supplies from a trapper she passed on the trail north, trading two of her good coat buttons brass substantial worth more than he probably realized for a portion of smoked meat and a handful of dried corn. It was not enough. It was what she had. 3 days later, she entered Cold Rock Canyon. The place felt abandoned by everything except physics. Towering walls of dark basalt rose until the sky became theoretical. A narrow stream threaded through stone that centuries of water had worn to a gray polish. Pine trees clung to ledges far overhead, their roots gripping cracks in the rock with the determination of things that had nowhere else to go. The canyon's reputation in the territory was specific and consistent, dangerous in winter, isolated in all seasons, unreachable by any road not worth the trouble it took to reach. For a girl who needed somewhere no one would bother to look, these qualities amounted to a recommendation. She did not choose a shelter site on the first night. This was the first real decision she made that separated surviving from merely continuing the choice not to collapse into the nearest overhang out of exhaustion, but to use what light remained for reconnaissance. She spent the first full day studying the canyon the way she had learned to study everything that mattered methodically without assumptions. Wind patterns first, she tracked them by watching how loose snow moved across different surfaces, identifying which overhangs channeled the prevailing gusts into concentrated force and which blocked them entirely. She examined the waterline markings on the stone walls, the horizontal striations left by decades of spring snowmelt, as the stream climbed and subsided, establishing which areas of the canyon floor flooded each year and which stayed dry regardless of what the mountains above chose to send down. She collected dead pine branches, the ones heavy with dried resin, their undersides still orange with sap despite months of cold. She bundled these with strips torn from her spare shirt, not because the shirt was expendable, but because fire was not. The shirt could be replaced eventually. A fire-starting failure at the wrong moment could not be recovered from. By late afternoon, she had a picture of the canyon that no one else currently alive probably possessed. The warmth arrived on the second day in the late afternoon, while she was pushing deeper into the canyon to survey its far reaches. She was crossing a section of floor where the stream bent closest to the eastern wall when something touched her left cheek, a current of air so faint she almost processed it as imagination. Her exhausted mind producing comfort the way exhausted minds sometimes did. She stopped walking, stood completely still. It came again. Not imagination, not a trick of wind deflecting off stone at some odd angle. Warmth, actual warmth, the kind that belonged in kitchens and lived in the space beside a working stove. Not here, not in a canyon where everything that wasn't frozen was in the process of becoming frozen, where the temperature had been dropping steadily for 6 hours and the ice on the stream had thickened another quarter-inch since morning. Wren turned slowly toward the eastern wall. The cliff face looked exactly like every other section of cliff face, dark basalt, ice-furred ledges, a thin coating of frost on every surface. She waited. The warmth didn't come again for almost a minute, and in that minute she had a full argument with herself about what a reasonable person would do, which was continue walking and find shelter before full dark made movement dangerous. Then it touched her cheek again, unmistakable, and she saw what she hadn't seen before. A section of the ice curtain hanging from a natural ledge was wrong. The ice everywhere else in the canyon was uniform opaque white-gray, frozen solid through. This section was darker at its base, translucent rather than opaque. The ice nearest the cliff face had been partially melted not by sun, which hadn't touched this part of the canyon floor today, but from behind, from within the stone. The meltwater had refrozen a few inches below the opening, creating a thin glassy formation rather than the dense pack that covered everything else. Something inside that wall was generating heat. Her pulse did something complicated. She approached slowly the way she had learned to approach anything in the mountains, whose nature was unclear, without assumptions, without the kind of hope that makes people stupid. She pressed her palm flat against the cliff surface beside the ice curtain and held it there. The stone was not cold. She moved her hand 6 inches. Cold. Moved it back. Not cold, not warm exactly. Not the warmth of a living body, but dramatically, undeniably different from the ambient temperature of everything surrounding it. Something deep beneath this mountain was producing heat and pushing it upward through the rock in a localized channel that surfaced here in this specific section of wall, warming the stone from beneath the way a buried coal vein warms the earth above it. She pulled the ice curtain aside with both hands. Behind it, the cliff face was not solid. A crack in the basalt ran from roughly knee-height to just above her head, no more than 8 inches wide at its broadest point, narrow enough to miss entirely from 3 feet away, narrow enough that the hanging ice had concealed it completely. Through the crack, she could feel the warmth more clearly now, a steady exhale from whatever space lay beyond, carrying with it air that was dry rather than the moisture-laden cold she had been breathing for hours. Ren turned sideways. The stone scraped her shoulder blades on both sides as she pushed through. She exhaled to make herself narrower. The rock pressed her coat flat against her spine. For 4 seconds, she was genuinely wedged, and the image of dying jammed in a crack in an Idaho canyon flashed through her mind with the bright clarity of an actual possibility. Then the pressure released. She stepped forward into what the crack had been concealing. The chamber was nothing like the narrow slot she had squeezed through. It opened suddenly and enormously, 30 feet wide, at least possibly more, the ceiling rising high enough that her lantern flame, which she had kept cupped in her hand through the crack, could not reach it with useful illumination. The floor was uneven, dark stone dry, absolutely dry, not a trace of the moisture that coated every surface in the canyon, and the air was warm. Not marginally less cold. Not the comparative warmth of a space sheltered from wind. Warm the way an enclosed room is warm when a fire has been burning in it all day. She raised the lantern. The light moved across the chamber in the slow way that lantern light moves in large spaces, finding surfaces, gradually illuminating details that assembled themselves into an impossible picture. Wooden shelves still attached to the stone walls with iron brackets. The wood warped and gray with age, but structurally present, refusing to have simply rotted away. Collapsed wooden crates in the corners, reduced to outlines of their former shapes under decades of dust. A rusted lantern hanging from a length of rope tied to a wooden beam that had been wedged between 2 rock outcroppings near the ceiling. The beam still there, still holding. Someone had lived here. Not camped, not sheltered temporarily. Lived had taken a geological accident and worked it into a dwelling with the deliberate patience of a person building something meant to last. The iron brackets in the stone walls had been hammered into place, which required tools and time and intention. The wooden beam supporting the hanging lantern had been precisely fitted, which required measuring and cutting and the patience to get it right. This was not improvisation. This was construction. Ren pressed her hand to the nearest wall, not the cold stone of the canyon exterior, but the living rock of the chamber itself, and held it there. The warmth was in the stone. Not surface warmth, deep warmth, the warmth of something far below that never changed because geology didn't have seasons. Geothermal activity, hot water moving through underground channels hundreds of feet down, heating the stone the way a furnace radiates through brick, and the thick walls of the chamber acting as insulation, holding that warmth in the same way a clay pot holds the heat of what it has cooked. The narrow entrance crack acted as a valve rather than a gateway, preventing the canyon's freezing air from flooding in and replacing the warm air trapped inside while allowing enough circulation to keep the space breathable. The result was a shelter that didn't depend on fire, didn't depend on fuel or weather or the ongoing physical effort of maintaining combustion. A shelter that kept itself. Wren stood in the middle of the chamber with her lantern held out at arm's length and turned in a slow circle, letting the light find each surface in sequence. The shelves, the crates, the iron brackets with their hand-forged heads, the lantern on its wooden beam, the ceiling she couldn't quite reach with the light, the south wall where a subtle movement in the air near the floor resolved itself when she walked closer and knelt down into a narrow opening, barely wider than her fist, through which a faint but steady current flowed outward. She put her hand in front of it, air moving from inside the chamber to outside the mountain, a consistent exhale, a natural ventilation current, whose source she couldn't see, but whose direction was unmistakable. Then, behind the largest of the collapsed shelves, wedged into a crack in the stone wall, with a deliberateness that could only have been intentional, she found the notebook. The cover was leather, darkened with age, spotted with mold along one edge, where moisture had reached it at some point in the last several decades. She lifted it carefully. The binding held stiff but intact. Many pages were damaged beyond recovery. The ink bloomed into gray ghosts by water, the paper fused at the edges. Others were intact, as though the stone wall had protected them from whatever had reached the cover. The handwriting inside was small and very precise, each letter formed with a care that suggested a man accustomed to recording things accurately, a man whose livelihood or safety might have depended at some point on the accuracy of his records. Each entry was undated but marked at the bottom with two initials, SC. She read what she could. The entries were practical in a way that struck her as characteristic, a person writing not to be understood by others, but to create a reference for their own future self. Notes on which areas of the chamber retained heat most reliably through the coldest nights, based on what she understood to be years of direct observation. Instructions on positioning a fire so that the smoke followed the existing air currents toward the entrance crack rather than collecting in the upper chamber. Observations on seasonal water behavior in the canyon, the stream's behavior in spring, the drainage patterns during heavy rain events, the specific indicators that warned of rising water levels before the rise actually reached the chamber floor. Notes on the shelves how deep the iron brackets needed to be set to hold weight without eventually pulling free when the stone expanded and contracted through freeze-thaw cycles. How to split the mounting points across different rock strata to distribute load more effectively. The kind of knowledge that could only come from extended trial, from failure, from living with the consequences of being wrong about a shelf bracket in a place where a supply trip to town meant a full day's travel in good weather. Then a page that made her stop reading and look up at the far corner of the chamber. The handwriting was the same careful script, but the pen had pressed harder into the paper. The words arrived faster, less organized. This was not a man documenting facts. This was a man documenting fear. The south ventilation shaft must never be blocked. If sealed carbon gases from any fire burning inside the chamber cannot escape, the air becomes poisonous within hours. The cave becomes a death trap. Keep the south shaft open at all times, no exceptions. She crossed to the south wall and knelt beside the narrow opening. The air still moved outward. Steady. She put her face close and breathed the same air she had been breathing, no different. She sat back on her heels and studied the opening with the focused attention she had given the canyon drainage patterns that morning. It was perhaps 4 inches wide, 8 inches tall, an irregular oval of darker shadow in the dark rock. From across the chamber, it was invisible. From 2 feet away, it was barely noticeable. She would not forget it. She did not need to write it down. The final pages of the notebook were gone. Not damaged, not aged away, torn. The removal had been done at the binding cleanly, with the deliberateness of someone who knew exactly what they were taking. 4 or 5 pages, judging by the remnants visible at the binding edge. Whatever SC had written in his final entries, someone had decided those words needed to not exist. Wren set the notebook down on the cleanest section of floor and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the unbroken space of the chamber, the volume of warm air it contained, the dry stone floor, the height of the ceiling, the existing shelves that only needed repair rather than construction, the natural ventilation, the natural heating, and made the decision that she would not fully understand the implications of for several more weeks. She was staying. She took the notebook to the nearest shelf and set it down carefully, then reached into her coat pocket and took out her mother's cloth-covered journal. She placed it on the shelf beside the notebook. 2 things belonging to people who were gone. 2 objects waiting for someone who came after. The work began the next morning. What followed was not comfortable and was never meant to be. Wren did not think of it as comfort. She thought of it as construction, which was different. Construction required attention and problem solving, and the ongoing modification of approach when what you were doing wasn't working. And it produced at the end of each day something that had not existed at the beginning of it. There was a satisfaction in this that had nothing to do with the result and everything to do with the process. She repaired the shelves using lengths of dead pine she dragged from the canyon floor, brittle in places, solid in others, requiring her to select carefully and cut with the small axe she'd traded for that first week with a hunter passing south. The iron brackets were corroded but not structurally compromised. She cleaned the worst of the rust with a flat stone and the chemical patience of someone who understood that metalwork was mostly just persistence applied to a surface problem. She organized what few supplies she had on the restored lower shelf. She gathered dry pine bundles from the canyon, the resin-heavy branches that would burn hot and fast when she needed flame and slow and steady when she needed coals. She identified the drainage patterns that SC's notes had described by walking the chamber floor carefully during the afternoon, tracing the path water would take if it entered through the eastern wall. Then the eastern wall showed her exactly what SC had meant. On the ninth night, the sound woke her before the sensation. A new sound close, not the distant murmur of the frozen stream which she had calibrated herself to in the way that campers calibrate themselves to the constant presence of something hearing it only when it stops. This was closer, interior, water finding its way through rock. She lit her lantern and saw it immediately, a thin seam of water working through a crack in the base of the eastern wall, spreading across the stone toward her sleeping platform, in the steady, patient way that water moves when given a surface and a direction. Rain mixing with snowmelt somewhere above the stream, rising the pressure of that rise, finding channels through the stone. SC's notes had described this possibility with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had experienced it. He had also described the solution a drainage channel along the eastern wall, following a path he had drawn in schematic detail, directing overflow toward a secondary crack in the south face, through which it could exit the chamber without collecting on the floor. Wren had no tools appropriate for excavating stone. She had a cooking pot. She knelt at the eastern wall and began. The pot was cast iron heavy with a flat bottom edge that could be scraped across stone with real force. The chamber floor was dark basalt, hard in a way that communicated itself clearly through her palms and into her shoulders as she worked a resistance that didn't negotiate. She scraped a channel 6 inches wide along the wall, following SC's schematic as precisely as she could interpret it, aiming for the depth he had specified 6 inches that would be sufficient to capture overflow before it spread across the floor. 4 hours. She counted time by the lantern level which she had learned to read with reasonable accuracy. The lantern was at its third low mark before the water began flowing down the channel she had cut rather than across the floor. The crack that SC had identified as the exit point took the water. She heard it move through the rock away from the chamber out into the canyon where it rejoined the water, already doing what water did in December. She sat with her back against the eastern wall and looked at the channel by lantern light, 6 inches deep, 12 feet long, cut into basalt with a cooking pot over the course of a single night, because the alternative was sleeping in cold water until spring. It worked. She had made it work. That was still true when she climbed back onto her sleeping platform and lay looking at the ceiling of the chamber where firelight made shadows move slowly across ancient stone, and she was still thinking about it when she finally slept. Jeb Morrow found the cave 11 days after Wren did, for the simple reason that smoke shouldn't have been coming from the rock. He had been running his trap lines through the high canyon country, a circuit he had worked for 15 winters, adjusted each year for wildlife patterns, weather damage to specific areas, the ongoing negotiation between what the mountains offered and what the market required. He knew every significant feature of Cold Rock Canyon the way a reader knows a familiar book automatically by position, with an intimacy that required no active thought. He knew precisely where smoke should not be. He almost missed the entrance 3 times. The crack was effectively invisible from any angle except the one directly in front of it, and from that angle it read as a shadow rather than an opening. He found it finally by moving his hand along the cliff face until the temperature changed. When Wren stepped out through the crack, Jeb Morrow took 2 steps backward with the involuntary force of a man whose expectations had been physically displaced. He was 55 years old. He had gray beard that had not seen scissors since September. His hands were scarred by a decade and a half of wire and trap mechanisms and the cold that makes everything sharper. He had managed to be startled by almost nothing for many years. "Where in the world did you come from?" The words arrived before his composure did. Ren looked at him with the calm of someone who had spent 11 days doing nothing but practical things in a dangerous place and had consequently used up all available concern on matters that required it. Inside, he went in. She listened to him navigate the crack, a less graceful transit than hers, punctuated by specific commentary about the rock dimensions. He emerged into the chamber and stood in the warm air with the stillness of a man whose body has received information his mind has not yet processed. He checked the drainage channel along the eastern wall without being directed to it. He looked at the reconstructed shelves, testing a bracket with both hands, applying lateral force and finding it hold. He moved to the sleeping platform, pressed down on it, reached under it, stood back up. "Need birch bark under this. Moisture from the stone wicks up into your bedding, even when the surface seems dry." He walked back out through the entrance, cracked stripped bark from the nearest birch tree, growing at the base of the canyon wall, brought it back inside and laid it under the platform, without asking whether Ren had an opinion on the subject. That was how Jeb Morrow communicated respect, through his hands. They sat outside the entrance in the gray afternoon light, and he told her things she needed to know. The canyon and the land surrounding it was claimed by Rutherford Crane, who had inherited the claim from his father, Edmund Crane, along with the ranch, the water rights, and the specific brand of authority that accrued to men who had shaped a territory long enough that the territory shaped itself around their preferences. Nobody in the valley was entirely certain how much of the Crane family's land claim was legitimate documentation versus the weight of 40 years of assumption. But the uncertainty was purely academic because nobody wanted to discover the answer. "Leland pushes back on people who push back on him," Jeb said, and then corrected himself. Rutherford Crane. People who question the Crane claim tend to find reasons to leave." Ren looked at the canyon walls rising into the late afternoon sky. "Let him come then." Jeb studied her for a long moment, the particular study of a man who has learned to read people the same way he read terrain, looking for the specific combination of factors that predicted what would happen next. What he saw was an 18-year-old girl with no money, no family, no legal standing, and no intention of going anywhere. He had seen that specific look before. He associated it with people who had nothing left to lose and had discovered to their own surprise that this was a kind of freedom. He picked up the leather notebook from the shelf inside before he left and turned to the initials at the bottom of each entry. Something moved through his expression, not surprise exactly, but a different kind of recognition. SC. The words came out quietly in the tone of a man picking up something he hadn't expected to find. "I think I know who this is. Give me a few days." He set the notebook back, walked out of the canyon without explaining anything further. The next day, Rutherford Crane arrived. He came on a gray horse accompanied by a man on a second mount. Both wore sidearms in the particular way that men wore sidearms in 1886, when they wanted the weapons noticed without the inconvenience of drawing them. The grammar of authority in a territory where law was whatever the man with the most land said it was. Crane himself was broad-shouldered, mid-50s, wearing a leather coat that had cost more than Ren had ever owned. He looked at her the way a landowner looks at a fence post that has materialized on his property without explanation or permission, as an object requiring removal rather than a person requiring conversation. "This canyon has been Crane land for 40 years. His voice was flat, certain, carrying the tone of a man reciting a fact so well established that arguing with it would be a category error. "You're trespassing." Ren looked at him steadily. "Do you have documents proving that?" The question landed in the space between them with a weight she hadn't entirely intended. Crane's eyes tightened, not anger yet, but the specific adjustment of a man whose script had just deviated from its expected path. Nobody who stood on what he considered his ground asked him for documents. "You have 3 days." He held her gaze for exactly the duration required to make the words mean what he intended them to mean. "Then I expect this place to be empty." He turned the horse. A few feet away without looking back, his voice carried the words with the casualness of something being mentioned rather than threatened. "Winter is long up here, a girl alone in the mountains. Lot of things happen that nobody ever hears about." Then the sound of hooves on frozen stone receding until the canyon absorbed it. Ren stood at the entrance for a time after the sound disappeared. She looked at the walls of the canyon, at the pale sky above them, at the ice on the stream. Then she went inside, took the axe from the shelf where she had balanced it, and went out to split wood. The rhythm of it, the rise and the fall, the blade finding the grain of the pine round and following it the clean crack of the split, did what repetitive physical work always did, filled the hands to quiet the mind. She split wood until the light failed completely. That evening, for the first time in 3 weeks, she opened her mother's journal. She had carried it through everything without opening it. Through the farm, through the road north, through Ashburn, through 11 days of building a home from stone and salvage, carrying it in her coat pocket where it pressed against her ribs with a weight that was not quite physical. She sat close to the small fire she had built more for light than warmth, opened the cloth cover, and turned to the last page her mother had written. The handwriting was barely readable. The letters shook, not the trembling of age, but the trembling of a hand fighting its own failure, pressing the pen harder to compensate for muscles that no longer reliably obeyed. Some words had been crossed out and rewritten. The ink had thickened toward the end of lines where the hand had slowed. Whatever her mother had been writing in those final weeks, it had cost her. The last entry ended mid-sentence, stopped not by a period or a comma, but by the simple fact that the sentence had not been finished. The most important thing I want you to remember is nothing after that. The rest of the page was blank, not empty in the way of a page waiting to be filled, but empty in the specific way of something interrupted. Something taken, something that had run out of time before it could be finished. Wren looked at those words for a long time. The fire settled in the small ring of stones. The warm air of the chamber moved against her face. Outside, the canyon held its December silence. She closed the journal and placed it back on the shelf beside SC's notebook. Two unfinished things side by side. Two people who had not gotten to say what they needed to say. She thought about Crane's words and about the 3 days he had given her. She thought about the drainage channel she had cut with a cooking pot in the middle of the night, about the shelves she had rebuilt, about the warmth in the stone walls that no amount of cold could touch. She thought about SC's careful handwriting in his torn-out final pages and the weight of Jeb's expression when he had looked at those initials. She was staying. The decision had the simplicity of things that are not actually decisions. She was staying the way the mountain kept its warmth, the way the south ventilation shaft kept its direction, the way her mother's final sentence kept its incompleteness. Because there was no other answer that was actually available. Outside, the first snow of the new storm began to fall against the canyon walls. Inside, the chamber held its warmth without effort, the way it had been holding it for however long it had been doing this, patient and geological and indifferent to everything human beings brought into it. Wren lay down on her sleeping platform with the birch bark beneath her and listened to the silence of the stone. Jeb returned 4 days after his first visit, arriving in the canyon at mid-morning with a brace of snowshoe hair over one shoulder and information that had cost him more than the hunting had. He came in without ceremony, set the hair on the lower shelf, looked at the fire ring, looked at Wren, then sat down on the flat stone nearest the south wall that had become, through repetition, his stone. He had asked around carefully. The old-timers in Ashburn, the ones who had been in the territory since before the Silver Fever, who remembered the valley before the Crane family name, had become synonymous with the valley itself, carried memories that younger residents had never acquired. One of them, a man named Purvis, who had worked a placer claim on a northern tributary in the 1850s, remembered a name without being prompted. He had needed only the initials. Solomon Cross. A miner, Jeb told her, using the word with its older meaning, a man who worked ore rather than land, who lived alone in the high country for several years, around 1850 through 1856. Quiet, self-sufficient, possessed of the particular competence that distinguished men who survived the mountains from the men who visited them. He had apparently known the Bitterroot Range better than anyone in the territory, which in that era was a significant distinction. Knowledge of terrain was a form of currency, sometimes the only form available. Then one winter he had simply stopped existing in any way that anyone could track. No body, no final sighting, no report filed with any territorial authority, because in 1856 the concept of filing a report about a solitary miner's disappearance would have struck most people in the Idaho Territory as an ambitious use of everyone's time. Men vanished. The mountains had reasons that they kept. This was understood. There's something else. Jeb's hands rested on his knees in the posture of a man choosing his words by their weight rather than their availability. He had mentioned Solomon Cross's name at the Ashburn Tavern 2 nights ago, dropped it into a conversation casually, the way you drop a stone into water when you want to see where the rings go. Rutherford Crane had been there. When he heard the name, Crane set his glass down on the bar with a force that split the bottom of it. Not a dramatic gesture, a controlled one almost. But the glass had cracked, the whiskey spreading across the barwood, and Crane had looked at nothing specific for a moment before calling for another. Wren crossed to the shelf where SC's notebook rested beside her mother's journal. She picked it up. She had been reading through the water-damaged pages more carefully over the preceding days, working through the blurred sections with the patience of someone assembling meaning from partial evidence. And she had found entries she had missed in the first-pass entries buried among the technical observations where a person skimming for practical content would overlook them entirely. She turned to the page she had found 2 nights ago. The handwriting was the same precise script as the rest, but the pen pressure was heavier here, the letters slightly larger, the spacing between words reduced as though the writer were accelerating. M came back today. This time he did not ask. He gave an order. He said, if I do not leave, he will make certain no one ever knows I existed here. Jeb read it without expression. She turned to the next page she had marked. I found mineral deposits along the eastern canyon wall 18 months ago. Silver possibly, enough to draw attention if anyone qualified ever surveyed this area. I told no one. I have no interest in mining. But G knows I am here. G wants this land clean of anyone who might complicate his family's claim. He does not know what I found. He only knows I am in the way. The fire between them did what small fires do. Moved, settled, released heat in the specific, uneven way of burning wood, the kind of warmth that had direction, rather than the wall's constant emanating heat. Jeb looked at the eastern wall for a moment. Then he looked at the notebook. G. The single letter arrived in the air between them with the weight of a conclusion neither of them had spoken yet. Edmund Crane. Rutherford's father, the man who had arrived in the Bitterroot Valley in the mid-1840s with nothing that anyone could later account for, who had accumulated land through a decade of transactions, whose specifics were either lost or never recorded, who had by 1860 controlled enough of the valley to make his preferences indistinguishable from local law. Nobody in Ashburn had ever been able to explain the arithmetic of that accumulation. They had simply adjusted to it the way people adjust to geography. The Cranes got rich off land, Jeb said, finally, his voice carrying the quality of a man reading something aloud that he has been trying not to see clearly. But nobody in this valley has ever been able to say exactly how. Orrin arrived with nothing. He corrected himself immediately. Edmund Crane, 40 years ago. 10 years later, he owned half the valley. People assumed luck or judgment. Nobody asked too hard because by then he was the man deciding whether your grazing rights got renewed. Wren looked at the torn edges at the back of the notebook, the clean lines where the final pages had been removed. Solomon Cross was in the wrong place at the wrong time. A quiet man living alone on land that a powerful family wanted kept empty. Jeb paused. The fire shifted. Sound familiar? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She replaced the notebook on the shelf with the deliberate care of something that now held a different kind of significance. Not just the instructions of a dead man, but the only remaining evidence of why he might have died, which meant it was also potentially the only leverage she had against the family that had come to tell her to leave. They agreed to keep the notebook's contents between them. The information was a shield, Wren told him, not a weapon, not yet. If Crane pushed hard enough, she had something that could raise questions his family had spent 30 years ensuring no one thought to ask. She did not need to prove what had happened to Solomon Cross. She only needed Rutherford Crane to understand that she could make the question itself visible. Jeb nodded at this with the slow approval of someone who recognized strategic thinking disguised as restraint. He stayed through the afternoon, and when the light began to fail, he didn't immediately stand to leave. Instead, he produced 2 lengths of cord from his coat pocket and set one on the stone beside Wren. His hands moved through the familiar series of positions, loop tension, anchor trigger mechanism, while he talked in the direction of the fire rather than at her. He had a daughter. Would be around 23 now, maybe 24 if his counting was reliable. He had not seen her since she was 8 years old. Her mother had left when he chose the mountains over town work, which was a polite way of saying she had chosen to stop waiting for a man who couldn't explain why he needed the distance but couldn't seem to close it either. She had taken the girl east. He had received letters for a period had opened, Some of them had eventually stopped opening them, had then reached the point where they stopped arriving. I told myself she was better off. The cord moved through his fingers with the automatic precision of 10,000 repetitions. That I wasn't built for what she needed. Maybe that was true. Maybe I just couldn't bear trying at something that mattered that much and discovering I would fail at it anyway. He set the finished snare aside without looking at it, placed the second length of cord on the stone in front of Wren. Your turn. Same knot. She picked up the cord, formed the loop incorrectly on the first attempt, the tension wrong the anchor point, not seated. Jeb reached over without comment, adjusted the position of two of her fingers, withdrew his hand. The gesture was entirely unconscious, the correction of someone who had taught this motion before, whose hands remembered what instruction looked like, even when the mind had convinced itself that teaching was finished. They completed 6 snares in the time it took the fire to burn from a reasonable height to a coal bed. Neither of them mentioned what he had said. The silence around it was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of something that has been said, heard, received, placed where it belongs without requiring a response that might diminish it. 3 mornings later, she woke before first light to a sound that had no precedent in the canyon's established vocabulary. High sustained rising, the sound carried through the canyon on still air with the purity of something produced by bodies rather than weather. Wolves. She dressed in the gray pre-dawn light and stepped outside. The snow around the entrance wore a record of the night's activity in pressed impressions. Large paws deep clustered beneath the branch where she had hung strips of cured venison to finish drying in the cold. A pack had found her food supply, had investigated it with the systematic thoroughness of animals that had enough experience with human food storage to know that investigation was worthwhile. The meat was gone. Not all of it. They had taken what they could reach, which was 3/4 of what she had prepared. The remainder swung on a higher branch out of the reach that the track suggested. Wren moved the remaining strips inside the chamber, hanging them from the highest shelf bracket, where the warmth would begin to affect the drying process, but would not reach temperatures that would spoil cured meat in the time it would take her to consume it. Then she gathered armfuls of green pine branches, the sap-heavy ones not suitable for burning, but ideal for producing the thick white smoke that carried a resin smell that predators had learned through enough generations of association to treat as a boundary marker. She built a smoky fire at the entrance and let it burn for most of the morning, filling the air with a haze that drifted through the canyon on the slight prevailing current. That night, she slept with Jeb's steel knife on the stone beside her hand, not because she expected wolves to breach the entrance crack, which was physically impractical for an animal their size, but because the expectation of something is sometimes more disruptive to sleep than the thing itself, and the knife made the expectation manageable. The pack circled the canyon for 2 more days. She tracked their movements by their prints, which appeared each morning around the perimeter with the regularity of patrol. On the 3rd day, the tracks simply stopped appearing. They had moved on to territory that offered easier returns, which was the wolves' version of an honest assessment. When Jeb came by and found the evidence, the prints around the canyon, the rearranged meat storage, the scorch marks at the entrance from the smoke fire, he stood and looked at everything without speaking. He looked at Wren. He nodded once. The calendar moved toward the storm. Cal Decker arrived in Ashburn on a Thursday afternoon, which was how most of the valley knew to take him seriously before he opened his mouth. He was the weather rider for this section of the territory, a Signal Corps-trained observer who traveled a circuit between the reporting stations, and he did not make social calls. When his dark horse appeared on the main street with snow crusted across both their shoulders, the people of Ashburn had 30 years of collective experience telling them to come outside. He tied his horse to the post outside Agnes Pruitt's store. He faced the crowd that gathered with the directness of a man who had learned that softening bad news was a form of disrespect. The reporting station to our north sent warnings this morning, a storm system forming the worst in several decades by the measurement instruments. It will reach this valley within 5 days, possibly earlier. Sustained blizzard conditions, temperatures lower than recorded here in living memory, heavy accumulation for a week, possibly longer. The silence that followed was the specific silence of people doing simultaneous calculations. Livestock stored food, roof load capacities. Wood supplied the particular arithmetic of survival that mountain people had already performed once at the start of each winter, and were now performing again under significantly changed parameters. Rutherford Crane stepped forward from the gathered crowd. He was the kind of man who understood that positioning during moments of public distress was a form of leadership whether or not any actual leadership occurred. His voice carried exactly far enough to cover the assembly. The houses in this valley have stood through plenty of winters. We'll manage. This is not the first hard season these walls have seen. He paused for the quality of pause that allowed people to feel reassured. Then, with a shift in his gaze toward the canyon direction that was slight enough to read as incidental, certainly no need for anyone to crawl into a hole in the rock like an animal. Several people laughed. Thin laughter, the kind that comes from wanting someone confident to be right badly enough to provide the sounds of agreement in advance. Agnes Pruitt watched through the window of her store. Her eyes moved from Crane to the mountains to Crane. Her expression was the expression of a woman who had learned to distrust solutions that presented themselves before the problem had been fully stated. Wren was not in Ashburn. She heard about the exchange later through Jeb, who had been present, and recounted it with the economy of a man who knew that the relevant details spoke without elaboration. What mattered was not the speech. What mattered was what Crane had communicated beneath it, that the coming storm was in his assessment, primarily a matter of which of them would look correct once it passed. 2 days before the storm's projected arrival, Wren woke at first light to discover that someone had been in the canyon during the night. Large stones, some requiring genuine physical effort to move, none small enough to have arrived by wind or water, had been dragged in front of the entrance crack. Not positioned to seal it completely. Positioned to narrow it, to obscure it, to transform it from a gap that the eye might catch on a searching sweep of the cliff face into a shadow that the eye would pass over without recognizing. She stood in the gray early morning and looked at the rocks and understood the specificity of the intent. Crane was not trying to trap her inside. He was not trying to kill her directly, which would have legal exposure he didn't need. He was trying to ensure that if the storm drove anyone to seek shelter in Cold Rock Canyon, if anyone knew about this place, and came looking for it in near zero visibility, while the snow reshaped every familiar surface, the entrance would simply not be findable. He was cutting her off from any connection to the outside world, making her irrelevant by making her invisible. 6 hours of work. Her palms split on the roughest of the stones, the skin peeling back from the base of her fingers where it caught on granite edges. Her lower back seized twice the specific muscle failure that came from lifting incorrectly when fatigued, forcing her to lie flat on the frozen ground until the spasm released. She moved the stones one by one, returning them to positions far enough from the entrance that they could not be conveniently repositioned. The two largest took the longest. She developed a system for those: chip a channel in the frozen ground to create a rolling path, then use a pine branch as a lever to get initial movement, then push from behind with her legs rather than her back. When Jeb arrived in the early afternoon and took in the displaced stones, the scrape marks on the frozen ground, the state of Wren's hands, the cold fury that moved across his face was the quiet kind. Not hot anger which burns fast and leaves ash, the kind that goes cold and stays cold and has the patience of the mountains themselves. "I will find Crane right now." The words were not loud. That was the concern. Wren looked at him steadily. If you go to Crane, you give him what he wants, a confrontation on ground he controls. When the law arrives, they ask who holds the deed. They ask who has a legal claim. You know how that question ends for us. Jeb picked up a rock the size of a water bucket and threw it into the stream below. The ice shattered. The water spray scattered across both banks and froze before it landed. He stood with his fists at his sides, breathing through his nose, staring at the place where the stone had gone in. The violence of the gesture and the control beneath it coexisted in a way that told Wren everything about what that moment cost him. Then he came back and began moving the remaining stones without another word. That was how Jeb Morrow handled the gap between what he wanted to do and what he was able to do. He closed the gap with his hands. That evening, Wren walked down to Ashburn. She needed someone in the valley who knew where the cave was, who would direct people there if the storm turned the kind of dangerous that drove people out of their homes. Someone who could not be intimidated by the Crane name, who had a practical rather than sentimental relationship to what the shelter could offer, who would come to their own conclusions without needing to be convinced of anything. She needed Agnes Pruitt. Agnes came the following morning. She made the climb with the measured pace of a woman who had been moving through difficult terrain for decades and had long since stopped spending energy on pace she couldn't recover. She said nothing during the ascent. When they reached the cliff face, she examined the entrance crack for a moment, then went through it without hesitation, without comment. Inside the chamber, Agnes Pruitt stood perfectly still for close to a full minute. Her hand went to the wall, first palm flat, holding the contact, the way Wren had held it on her own first day reading what the stone was communicating. Her eyes moved to the shelves, to the sleeping platform with its birch bark underlining, to the drainage channel along the eastern wall, to the fire ring positioned precisely for the air current, to the south wall where the ventilation shaft opened near the floor. You built this alone, not a question in accounting. A man named S.C. helped, he just wasn't here for it. Agnes looked at the notebook on the shelf. She looked at Wren with an expression that contained nothing sentimental and nothing patronizing. It was the expression of a woman who recognized a specific achievement because she had attempted something similar under different conditions, who had opened her store the morning after her husband's funeral, while every man in Ashburn waited politely for her to do the sensible thing and go live with her sister in Lewiston. Recognition plain and undecorated. You need more blankets. Agnes's voice was practical the way a scalpel is practical precision in service of a specific outcome. Medical supplies as well. The next morning, she climbed back up, carrying items she had selected with the judgment of someone who had spent years providing first aid in a part of the world where the nearest physician was a 2-day ride in good weather. 3 wool blankets, dense enough to retain warmth even when damp. A box of tallow candles. A canvas bag holding rolled bandages, antiseptic tincture suture thread, with 3 needles white willow bark extract for fever management. She set the supplies on the shelf and looked at the south ventilation shaft one more time before leaving. Whatever happens in that storm, whatever you need to do, keep that opening clear. She didn't gesture toward it. She didn't need to. She had spent enough years in rough country to know that sealed spaces and open flames were a combination that killed silently without the mercy of warning. The storm arrived 3 days after Cal Decker's announcement, carrying exactly the authority his instruments had promised. It did not build. It did not give the valley a preliminary evening of warning wind and preliminary snow. 1 hour the canyon was still and gray and waiting. The next the mountains had simply vanished behind a moving wall of white so dense that Wren standing at the entrance could not see the opposite canyon wall. Wind tore through the canyon with a force that had moved past the category of weather event into something more geological. A vibration she felt in her molars, in the bones of her forearms, in the back of her sternum. Snow did not fall so much as arrive from every direction, simultaneously driven sideways, collected in vertical drifts against any surface that provided resistance, accumulating with a speed that was difficult to believe until you had watched it. Within 2 hours, the stream had disappeared. Within 4, the canyon floor had been reshaped entirely, its familiar geography replaced by smooth white forms that bore no relationship to what lay beneath them. Inside the chamber, the lantern flames stood straight. Wren spent the first day doing what she had learned to do with uncertainty. She organized inventory of food supplies by caloric density rather than volume, establishing how long she could sustain herself under current conditions versus how long a worst-case scenario might last. Inspection of the ventilation shaft, clear, moving properly, the draft pulling a thin thread of smoke from a small test fire in exactly the right direction. Inspection of the entrance crack for any sign that ice was accumulating on the outside in ways that might affect the ability to pass through. It was not. The warmth that bled through the stone around the opening was sufficient to prevent ice adhesion at the immediate entrance. She was checking the drainage channel habit rather than necessity, the way competent people check things that don't need checking, simply to confirm they don't need checking when the sound at the entrance came. Not a knock exactly. The sound of a body making contact with the rock near the opening without the force or direction of intentional knocking. The sound of someone who had arrived at a destination using the last of what they had. Wren moved to the entrance. Ezra Holt was 72 years old, a retired blacksmith whose hands had the dimensions of a man's life work. He was standing, barely standing, with Mabel Holt beside him, her slight frame leaning against his in the configuration of 2 people who have spent 50 years learning how to share load. Snow covered both of them from crown to boot. Ice had formed on Mabel's eyebrows, on the fringe of her scarf, on the surfaces of Ezra's coat, where the wool had been compressed by cold, below its insulating threshold. His lips had gone the specific blue that belonged past cold and approaching something else. The firebox cracked. His voice was barely enough to carry across the distance between them, rationed with the care of someone aware that output had limits. "We couldn't keep it lit." Ren stepped aside from the entrance. "Come in." She helped Mabel through the crack first, then Ezra, who navigated the narrow passage with the deliberate movement of a man whose legs had been negotiating with him about stairs for the past several years. Inside, the warmth received them, the way warmth receives extreme cold immediately, dramatically, a physical event rather than a gradual adjustment. Mabel Holt pressed her hand flat against the warm stone wall with the expression of someone who has received news they didn't know how to hold. Ren wrapped them in Agnes's blankets while the fire built up from its careful maintenance level to something warmer. Ezra held Mabel's hand. He watched her face register the warmth, watched the color begin its slow return to her fingers and her cheeks, and said nothing because Mabel's face said everything for both of them. More people came the next day. A trapper whose cabin roof had surrendered to accumulated snow load. At some point in the previous night, he had woken to the sound of cracking timber and had moved fast enough to exit before the structure fully failed. A widow named Bess, who had run through her wood supply on the second night and had been managing with furniture after that and had run through the furniture. A family husband, wife, 2 children, the younger one crying with the particular cry of a child who is cold in a way that has moved past discomfort into fear. Then another family. Then 3 men from a sheep operation whose shelter had flooded when the drainage around their building failed under the weight of melt from a partial roof collapse. They came through the entrance, one at a time, each person emerging into the warm chamber with the same sequence of expressions. Disbelief at the warmth, disorientation at the space, then a settling into something quieter as the body accepted what the mind was still processing. Many of them had heard the stories, had laughed at the stories, some of them the girl living in the cliff, the magic cave, the absurdity of taking seriously any account of warm air inside frozen rock. They squeezed through solid basalt in a blizzard and found warmth waiting on the other side, and laughter was no longer a resource available to them. Harv Stubbs was among the arrivals on the second day. 45 years old, broad-faced with the weathered look of a man who worked land that was never quite as cooperative as he needed it to be. He had been among the loudest voices in the Ashburn Tavern when the topic of the girl in the cliff had come up 3 weeks ago. Not vicious in his mockery, but consistent. The kind of laughter that became part of the room's texture because it was never contradicted. He came through the entrance and stopped just inside. The red in his face was not from cold. He looked at the shelves, at the sleeping platforms, at the 20-odd people in various stages of recovery from exposure. He looked at the warmth that the stone continued to produce without fire, without effort, without any mechanism he could identify. He did not look at Ren. She crossed the chamber and handed him a blanket without meeting his eyes, without pausing, without giving him either the mercy of not noticing or the punishment of making him acknowledge what noticing meant. Just the blanket placed in his hands, the next task no different from the last. Harv Stubbs received it with both hands and looked at the floor. A man in wet clothing sat heavily near the fire ring and began within 30 seconds of arrival to voice specific dissatisfactions. The space was insufficient for the number of people in it. The food supply was inadequate. The ventilation was questionable. He failed to see why a collection of grown adults in distress was being managed by, he looked at Ren, whoever this was. Ezra Holt stood up. The old blacksmith rose from his position beside Mabel with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had spent half a century knowing that the correct application of force required correct positioning first. He was not large in the way of young men who are large. He was large in the way that certain old men are large, as though their mass had been compacted over decades into something denser than its original form. He looked at the complaining man with eyes that had spent 50 years staring into forge heat and were consequently impressed by almost nothing. "You are standing in her house." The words arrived with the flat authority of a fact rather than an opinion. "She built it. She opened the door. You will lower your voice." The chamber went silent in the complete way that chambers go silent when something has been said that reorganizes the room around it. The man lowered his voice. He did not speak again that night on any subject beyond the specific practical questions of where to sleep. Ezra sat back down and took Mabel's hand. Mabel patted his arm once, twice the gesture of a woman communicating that yes, that was correct. That was the right thing, that she had known for 52 years, that he was the right man. Jeb arrived on the second day of the storm, entering through the crack with a half-inch coating of ice on every external surface of his clothing coat hat the outer face of his beard. He stood just inside the entrance and looked at the chamber's population with an expression that contained both exhaustion and a kind of mathematical amazement. Wren pressed him close to the fire. He held his hands toward it and stared at the warm stone walls. "It's warmer in here than my cabin." That's what I kept telling people. Nobody believed you. Neither of them laughed because both of them understood that the true version of that sentence was not particularly funny. He brought news from outside. 3 structures in the valley had already lost their roofs. One family had lost the majority of their livestock in the first 12 hours the barn overwhelmed the animals, unable to generate sufficient collective heat without adequate insulation against temperatures that had dropped below anything the older residents had experienced. Crane's barn, large enough to shelter 30 people comfortably, with the structural integrity of a building maintained by a man who kept his property in the condition befitting his self-image, had its gates locked from the inside. Crane was admitting people by selection. Those who owed him money, those whose cattle used his grazing rights, those whose relationship to him was built on a ledger he maintained, who would remember when this was over, who had opened a door for them in the worst storm of living memory. He was using the storm the way he used everything, as a mechanism for obligation. 30 people in warmth, while others froze specifically so that 30 people would emerge from this winter carrying a debt. Wren said nothing to this. She picked up her axe and went to split more kindling, not because the supply was low, but because some information required her hands to be busy while her mind worked through what it meant. Agnes arrived on the 3rd day, not seeking shelter her house in Ashburn was holding. She arrived with her full medical kit and a quantity of candles that suggested she had made a specific calculation about how long extended exposure to cold and stress produced wounds at a predictable rate. She went to work immediately, moving through the chamber with the efficient authority of someone who has operated in field conditions before and understands that the work is the point rather than the explanation for doing it. She examined fingers for frostbite, identified 3 cases requiring active treatment: circulation, restoration, careful warming, the specific management of tissue that has been damaged rather than merely chilled. She assessed the 2 children for respiratory symptoms, spending particular attention on the younger one who had been crying during arrival. She cleaned and dressed a gash on the forearm of the man whose barn roof had collapsed, a wound he had apparently been ignoring for 2 days, on the theory that wounds in difficult circumstances resolve themselves, which was not a theory Agnes Pruitt had patience for. On the 4th night, Mabel Holt's breathing changed. It was the kind of change that was audible only if you were listening for it, a deepening quality to the respiration, a slight increase in rate, a sound underneath the breath that hadn't been there during the preceding days. Agnes heard it from across the chamber while she was organizing supplies. She crossed to Mabel without hurrying because hurrying communicated alarm, and alarm was not useful. She assessed quickly, hands moving through a practiced examination chest, throat temperature at the forehead and at the base of the neck. Pneumonia beginning stages. In a healthy 30-year-old, serious but manageable. In a 72-year-old woman who had already been exposed to extreme cold, while depleted, the window of effective response was narrower. Agnes made no announcement. She repositioned Mabel using folded blankets to elevate her upper body, improving respiratory mechanics by taking the pressure of her own weight off her lung capacity. She set water to boil over the fire and arranged the pot so that Mabel, propped upright and turned slightly toward it, would breathe the humidified air. She began willow bark preparation, measuring extract into the smallest available cup, adding enough warm water to make it tolerable. Wren appeared at her side before being asked. She understood without instruction what needed doing next: fire maintenance at a specific temperature, not too hot enough, water replacement when the steam production dropped, fresh cloths for the fever that was developing across Mabel's forehead. She moved without speaking because speaking would have required attention that was better spent elsewhere. The 2 of them worked through the night side by side, communicating through the handing of objects, the repositioning of a patient, the small adjustments of ongoing care. Agnes had done this kind of work in conditions that varied from worse to slightly better, always in the presence of factors she could not fully control, always with the knowledge that competence was not a guarantee, but was the only available alternative to its absence. By early morning, Mabel's breathing had steadied. The wet quality beneath it was still present but lighter. Her fever had not climbed further. Her eyes, when she opened them at sunrise, found Ezra's face with the immediate recognition of someone returning from a distance, rather than arriving from sleep, and the expression that moved across both their faces in the moment of that finding was the kind that didn't require witness. Ezra looked at Wren, then at Agnes. He said nothing. He did not need to. The storm continued without the courtesy of pausing to allow anyone inside or outside the chamber to recover from what it had already done. Day 5. Day 6. The wind that had been constant since the beginning began to feel less like a weather event than a permanent condition, something that had always been there and would continue indefinitely, an axiom of the new world rather than a disruption to the old one. On the 7th evening, the chamber held 22 people. The food supplies that they had collectively contributed. Each arrival had brought what they had not through instruction, but through the unspoken logic of people who understood the arithmetic of shared survival, were organized on the restored shelves with the systematic efficiency of a woman who had spent 3 weeks learning how to assess what she had against what she needed. Children slept in the warmest corner nearest the south wall where the geothermal gradient was strongest. The adults arranged themselves around the perimeter on sleeping platforms and improvised bedding. The fire in the ring burned at a controlled height enough for light and cooking managed carefully against the ventilation shaft's capacity, which Wren had checked each morning. The shaft continued to draw properly the current through the south opening, steady the air in the chamber clean. On the 7th night, Wren lay on her platform and could not sleep. Something was wrong. Not a feeling. She had learned to distrust feelings in the absence of evidence, because feelings in dark caves during blizzards were shaped by exhaustion rather than reality. This was something more specific. A sound at the edge of perception, barely there rhythmic, in the particular way that mechanical failure was rhythmic, rather than the way weather or water or human activity was rhythmic. She lit her lantern from the banked coals and moved to the entrance. The sound grew more defined as she crossed the chamber. By the time she reached the entrance crack, it was identifiable ticking. The specific percussion of crystalline material under stress stone, cracking along its grain in small increments, each crack releasing a brief sound before the pressure redistributed and the system rested until the next threshold was reached. She raised the lantern and looked at the rock above the entrance. A fracture line ran across the natural stone slab that formed the overhead lintel of the entrance crack. It had not been there when she had checked 3 days ago. 7 days of continuous blizzard had piled snow against the external cliff face in a pattern that was not uniform. The accumulation was significantly heavier on the left side of the entrance due to a slight bias in the prevailing wind direction over this section of the canyon wall. The uneven load was applying lateral force to the slab, which had been held in equilibrium by balanced pressure from the surrounding stone. That equilibrium was failing. The fracture was small, a hairline the thickness of a credit note's edge. It was growing. She turned to look at the south wall. The ventilation shaft was not right. She crossed to it in 5 steps, knelt, put her face near the opening. The current that should have been moving outward was reduced, not absent, not yet, but diminished to a fraction of its normal flow. 7 days of wind-driven snow had been pushing material into the opening, packing it in the specific way that wind-driven material packed not loosely, but under continuous force that compressed each layer before the next arrived. The shaft was perhaps 60% occluded. Wren remained kneeling beside the shaft for a moment, with her lantern held out from her body. 2 problems, both active, both moving toward their respective failure points at their own speeds, on their own timelines, neither aware of the other. If the lintel slab failed, the entrance sealed. 22 people inside a warm cave with no exit. Death by attrition, not immediately. They had food, water from condensation collection, no immediate physical danger. But eventually, and without any remaining possibility of help or escape. If the ventilation shaft sealed completely, while fires continued burning, the carbon gas would accumulate. Colorless. Without smell at any concentration a human could detect before neurological function began to fail. People would become confused, then sleepy, then unable to wake. In a space this size with fires, this size, SC's note had said hours. The math of 22 people breathing in an enclosed space made hours a generous estimate. Lintel failure meant death over days. Shaft closure meant death over hours. Ventilation first. Wren did not wake everyone. She crossed to where Jeb slept and touched his shoulder. He opened his eyes in the complete way that men who have lived alone in wilderness for 15 years open their eyes, not groggy, not confused, present without transition. She had come to understand this about him. Sleep, for Jeb Morrow, was a lighter country than it was for people who felt safe. 2 problems. She kept her voice at a volume that reached him rather than the chamber. Both need attention at the same time. She showed him both the fracture, the shaft. He examined each with the hands-on thoroughness of a man who needed to understand something physically rather than conceptually. His jaw tightened when he assessed the fracture. His expression when he looked at the shaft carried a different quality, something that recognized an older fear, a less visible danger. Agnes appeared at Ren's elbow. She had been asleep 3 feet away and had apparently been asleep in the same light way Jeb had. Her examination of the shaft was faster than Jeb's. She understood. She pivoted immediately. The fires go out first. Her voice had the quality of a decision rather than a suggestion. All of them. Now. Before anything else. If that shaft closes another inch while flames are burning, the air in this chamber will be poisonous before anyone feels sick enough to understand why. Jeb looked at her. In this temperature without fires, people can survive cold for the time it takes to address the shaft. The answer arrived without argument in it, without the quality of someone making a case. It was simply the order of operations stated by someone who had done the calculation. They cannot survive what happens if we keep burning while the ventilation closes. The fires went out one after the other. The chamber descended into a darkness that was total. The lanterns Ren kept burning gave enough light to work by, but not enough to push back the dark at the room's edges where the children were. Somewhere in that darkness, a small voice made a sound that was trying not to be afraid. A woman's voice came in response, low, steady, the murmur of someone converting their own fear into something a child could use. Then from the far side of the chamber, Ezra Holt's voice, unhurried, carrying the natural authority of a man whose life had been spent working near things that could kill him if he lost focus, who had consequently developed a deep professional relationship with calm. What do you need done? Ren told him. Timber from the spare sleeping platform, cut to length, braced vertically between the lintel slab and the floor, as many supports as the available wood allowed, placed to redistribute the slab's load before the fracture reached the propagation point, where rapid failure became likely. She told Jeb she was going outside. The word outside, in the context of what was currently outside, produced a silence from Jeb that was not agreement and was not refusal, but was the specific silence of a man processing something he objected to strenuously but could not factually counter. The ventilation shaft exit on the external cliff face was a location Ren knew precisely. She had identified it during her first week during her systematic examination of every feature of the canyon wall surrounding the chamber. In zero visibility and wind that had been building for 7 days, with snow that had reshaped every surface and removed every visual landmark, she was the only person currently alive who could find it. That was not bravery. That was logistics. Jeb tied one end of his trap line rope to a boulder at the entrance. Ren tied the other end around her waist. He looked at her in the lantern light with the expression of a man who had used up all available arguments and had arrived at the place where the only remaining option was trust. She went through the crack. The storm hit her body with the full force of 7 days of accumulated intention. The first 3 seconds were purely physical cold and wind and disorientation of a completeness that preceded thought. She pressed herself against the cliff face with both hands and waited for her nervous system to process what had happened and return control of her limbs. Then she began counting steps. 22 steps south along the cliff face, one hand always in contact with the stone, the rope at her waist, the only reliable connection between herself and the chamber. The snow was above her knees in some places, compressed to a hard surface in others, where wind had scoured rather than deposited. She moved through both conditions, the way she moved through every condition, with the patience of someone who had learned that the amount of time a thing takes is determined by what the thing requires rather than what you prefer. She found the shaft's external opening by feel rather than sight. Her fingers recognized the specific texture change at the margin of the opening before any temperature differential reached her cold, numbed hands. She began removing the packed snow with her fingers, no gloves, because she needed to feel what she was doing, needed to know the difference between the compacted snow that was blocking the shaft and the stone that surrounded it. The packed snow resisted. She broke her technique against it and developed a different one-pressure release twist extract. Working methodically, one handhold at a time, ignoring the pain that arrived and then stopped arriving as her hands moved further past the temperature at which nerves reliably functioned. When the last core of packed snow broke free, the warm air from inside the mountain moved across her frozen palms. The same warmth. The same current that had stopped her walking in December and redirected the entire trajectory of what followed. The mountain still breathing, still pushing its warmth upward through the stone regardless of what accumulated above it or below it or beside it, regardless of what human beings had brought into it or taken from it, regardless of storms. Wren rested her forehead against the cliff face for a moment. Then she moved back north along the rope, found the entrance, climbed the rock to the left of the crack, where she knew the snow had accumulated most heavily on the left side of the lintel. Located the specific section, by memory began clearing it with her arms, redistributing the load, giving the slab the balance it had lost. A handhold failed under her left hand. Her feet lost the surface. She swung outward from the cliff on 3 fingers of her right hand with the full weight of her body on them and nothing beneath her feet, and the storm doing what the storm did. She found a root frozen, projecting perhaps an inch from the rock face with the outside edge of her right boot. The root held. She held. 5 heartbeats. Then she found new contact with the cliff and kept working. Inside, she could hear faintly through the rock the rhythmic percussion of timber being driven into place. Ezra's voice barely audible directing. Another voice responding. The sounds of people working in the dark on a problem they could not fully see, guided by the instructions of a girl they had known for 7 days, trusting the work because they had already decided in the hours since they arrived that the work was trustworthy. The ticking stopped. She wasn't sure exactly when. She was focused on the snow redistribution, on maintaining contact with the cliff face, on the ongoing negotiation between her hands, and the cold that had removed most of the sensation from them. But at some point she became aware that the sound she had been hearing since she woke no longer existed, and that its absence had a different quality than mere quiet. She worked until the load felt balanced, until the left side was no longer heavier than the right, until the slab, by her best reckoning of what she could assess through frozen hands on frozen rock in a blizzard, had what it needed to hold. Then she followed the rope back through the crack. Agnes cut the rope from Wren's waist because Wren's hands could not manage the knot. This was the first thing that happened when she came back through the crack. Agnes was there, knife already out the cut clean. Then the blankets wrapped without ceremony. Then the examination fingers pressed one at a time, nails checked for color, returned the skin at her wrists, assessed with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this triage, in conditions that varied from worse to merely bad. No permanent damage, close, but the tissue is still viable. Agnes's voice carried the tone of a verdict rather than reassurance. She was not a woman who softened medical findings for emotional comfort. Wren's teeth were producing a sound she couldn't stop. 3 words pushed through it, the shaft clear. I know, the air is moving again. Agnes had already checked. Of course she had. Someone rebuilt the fires. The first flame caught with the specific sound of ignition in a cold, oxygen-rich space. A brief, sharp sound, then the steady commitment of burning. Light came back into the chamber in stages, beginning with the immediate warmth of the fire's glow, reaching outward to the walls, climbing to the ceiling, where the shadowed stone received it. The ventilation shaft drew properly. The smoke moved south with the unhurried certainty of a current that had been following this path since before anyone in the chamber had been born. People were awake now, most of them the deeper sleepers still finding the surface. The children already alert with the particular alertness of small bodies that had processed the darkness as something requiring vigilance. Nobody asked what had happened. They could see enough of what had happened from what they observed: the timber supports braced against the entrance lintel, the fresh scrape marks on Jeb's palms, the state of Wren's hands as Agnes worked on them, the quality of attention that Ezra Holt was giving to the newly reinforced entrance structure from across the room. They had been in the dark for however long it had taken. They had done what they were asked to do. The mountain had held its end. Nobody called her a hero. Nobody made a speech about what she had walked into or come back from. The people in that chamber had, over the preceding 7 days, already recalibrated who Wren Calloway was, not through declaration, but through the accumulation of observation. The speech had already been delivered by the drainage channel, by the stacked supplies, by the way she had known about the ventilation shaft before anyone else in the room had thought to look. What they gave her now was not gratitude, but something quieter. They listened when she spoke. They moved when she indicated movement was needed. They offered information to her before offering it to anyone else in the room. That was respect distilled to its functional minimum, earned through action, offered without ceremony. Harv Stubbs was the one who brought her water. He crossed the chamber with the tin cup held in both hands, set it near her without making eye contact, withdrew, before the gesture could become a conversation. The cup was full, the water warm from proximity to the fire. It was the only apology his pride would permit delivered in the grammar of small physical actions, because words of that particular type had never been available to him. Wren drank the water. She held the cup between her palms to take the warmth from it. Morning came morning, being a conceptual rather than optical event inside the chamber, identified by the shift in the storm's quality more than by any change in available light. The blizzard had been running for 7 full days now, and it carried the sound of something that had found its rhythm and intended to maintain it indefinitely. The people in the chamber had learned to stop trying to predict when it would end. That expectation was itself a form of energy expenditure that the situation didn't support. Agnes was with Mabel when the day began, which was where she had been for most of the night. Mabel's fever had stabilized at a level that was not safe but was not climbing. Her breathing was still wet at its base, the sound of fluid accumulation that was not severe but was present, requiring ongoing management. Agnes worked with the attentiveness of someone who understood that the difference between pneumonia that turned a corner and pneumonia that didn't was often measured in the consistency of care during specific hours rather than in any single intervention. Wren came to sit beside them periodically through the morning, not to assist but to be present, to be another person in proximity, because Agnes had been alone in her vigilance for long enough. She brought tea prepared from the dried supply Agnes had included in her medical kit. She kept the fire at the specific temperature Agnes had indicated was optimal for the steam inhalation, not higher. She replaced the damp cloths on Mabel's forehead with the timing that Agnes demonstrated through her own actions rather than through instruction. By midday, Mabel opened her eyes with genuine clarity for the first time since the fever had arrived. Ezra was holding her hand. He had not left her side through the night except to help brace the lintel timber when Wren had come back through the crack, and he had returned immediately after. When Mabel's eyes found his face, the expression that crossed his, that crossed both of theirs, was the private language of two people who had spent half a century developing a vocabulary that existed between them alone. He raised her hand and pressed it briefly to the side of his face. She let him. The gesture lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It was not small. He looked at Wren over Mabel's head, then at Agnes. His eyes said what his voice would not have been adequate for, which was everything. On the 8th day, Cal Decker arrived. He came through the entrance in the mid-afternoon barely. His coat had been defeated by the storm somewhere in the preceding hours. Not torn, not lost, but simply overwhelmed its insulating capacity, exhausted by the combination of duration, wind, and the specific temperature that the instruments had been promising for days. He was moving with the careful deliberateness of a body that has been allocating resources for survival, rather than comfort rationing heat, to the organs that required it most at the expense of the extremities that didn't. Jeb caught him at the entrance when his legs negotiated a change in terms. They sat him beside the fire. Agnes assessed while the warmth began its work. Wren watched the process, the color returning by stages to his face, the trembling starting as his muscles received permission to react, rather than brace the eyes, focusing as his blood recirculated to the level where thought became reliably available. After 20 minutes beside the fire, he looked around the chamber with eyes that were now doing their job. He looked at the people arranged across the sleeping platforms, at the children sleeping in the corner, at Mabel propped against her blankets, drinking tea, at Ezra beside her at the shelves with their organized supplies, at the timber supports at the entrance, at the ventilation shaft, drawing clean air through its south opening. It's true. The words arrived with the quality of a man who had heard a story and discounted it, and has now arrived at the location the story described. There's actually a warm house inside a canyon wall. Wren's voice was even. That's what I kept telling people. He had news. The storm would continue for at least 3 more days by the station's most recent readings. On his way to the canyon, he had passed the Crane Ranch. The barn doors were closed, lamplight visible through the siding gaps, voices audible from inside when the wind paused. Crane had his selected people in there, the ones he had admitted through the calculation of obligation rather than the simpler logic of need. The barn that could have sheltered the majority of the valley's population during the worst storm in living memory was being used as a ledger entry. Wren said nothing. She had already done her accounting on Rutherford Crane, had placed him in the part of her understanding where things went, when they were not problems she was able to solve, but were problems she needed to see clearly. That evening, with the chamber at its fullest, and the fire banked to the careful level, Jeb sat near the entrance in his habitual position, the flat stone his back against the wall, the posture of a man who preferred proximity to exits on general principle. He had been quiet for most of the day, with a quality of quiet that Wren had learned to recognize as thoughtfulness rather than withdrawal. "You know what troubles me." His voice was conversational, addressed to the general company rather than to any specific person, though his eyes were on the middle distance. Several people looked at him. The whole valley laughed. He gestured at nothing specific at the chamber, at the idea of the chamber, at the weeks of accumulated mockery that had preceded the current arrangement. Called it ridiculous. A girl living inside a mountain. He paused. His eyes moved slowly around the space, the sleeping platforms holding people who had arrived in desperation, the shared food on the shelves, the children sleeping against parents who were sleeping against strangers who a month ago would not have crossed the street for each other without a reason. Now half the valley is living in it. The laughter that followed was real. Not the nervous, thin laughter of people choosing comfort over honesty, but the deeper laughter of people who have survived something together and are now permitted to recognize the absurdity at its edges. Several of them had been among those laughing in the tavern. Several of them were laughing now at the same fact from a different position, which is how irony becomes bearable when you are on the inside of it rather than the outside. Wren laughed too, because it was true, every word of it, and the trueness of it had saved the lives of everyone in the room, which was the best possible reason for something to be true. The laughter settled. The chamber returned to its evening sounds. The fire, the quiet conversations of people who had been in close quarters long enough to have moved past the formal distance of strangers, the breathing of sleeping children. Wren lay on her platform with the tiredness of the past 7 days, finally finding full purchase on her body, and she was moving towards sleep when she heard it. Not the storm, not the fire. A sound from the entrance, not the ticking of stressed stone, which had not returned since the timber supports went in. Something different, softer, more irregular. The sound of bare knuckles against frozen rock, produced by hands that had been closed against cold for so long that opening them was an act of will rather than reflex. She was at the entrance before she had made a conscious decision to move. The figure on the other side of the crack was not immediately recognizable. The cold had taken the characteristics she knew and replaced them with the generic presentation of someone who had been outside too long. The gray-white quality of skin that has ceded its normal temperature. The blankness in the eyes that arrived when a body was directing all available processing toward the question of whether the next minute was survivable. The beard was wrong, longer, unattended, grown in the manner of a man who had stopped managing his own appearance. The coat was wrong, too thin for this weather, a fact she noted with a specific quality of recognition because she knew who owned that coat. It had been hanging on a hook by the kitchen door for as long as she had been alive. Doyle Calloway looked at her with eyes that were doing the work of focusing from a distance. The expression on his face when he found hers was not the expression she had carried in her own imagination through the weeks since November. She had constructed various versions of this encounter: anger, justification, the cold courtesy of people who have settled their accounts. What she had not constructed was this: the expression of a man who had been taken apart by something larger than himself, in whom shame had moved past the social performance of it into something structural. He was not performing contrition. He was wearing it the way the storm had worn him, completely without remainder. She stood in the entrance crack with the warm air of the chamber at her back. 2 seconds of stillness. 3. Long enough for every feeling she had stored with careful deliberateness, the anger, the bitterness, the relief that arrived with a force she resented because it was not appropriate to the history, the concern that existed underneath everything else and that she had told herself repeatedly was not her concern anymore, to arrive simultaneously without sequence, without any architecture to organize them into something manageable. She stepped aside. "Come in." 2 words. The same 2 words she had said to Ezra Holt, to Harv Stubbs, to every person who had knocked at this entrance during the storm. She gave them the same weight, the same absence of ceremony, the same practical openness that had been her policy from the first knock. The cost of saying them this time was not visible in her voice. It was visible only to her in the specific way that it occupied her chest as she said them. He came through the crack. He stood inside the chamber and looked at what she had built. The shelves, the lanterns, the sleeping platforms, The organized supplies, the people of the valley distributed across the space in the configurations of people who had found a place that would keep them. His eyes moved across the room with the accumulating disbelief of a man counting the gap between what he had imagined and what he was observing. When his gaze returned to her face, the shame had deepened into something that occupied more of him than shame usually occupied. It had the quality of weight, physical weight, the kind that changed how a person stood. Jeb was watching. He looked at Wren, then at Doyle, then at Wren again, reading the information in the specific way people stood relative to each other, in the quality of the silence between them. Who is he? Wren's answer was direct, unelaborated. He needs a warm place, that's all. Jeb heard the answer that lived inside the answer. He asked nothing further. Agnes worked on Doyle's hands without being asked. 2 fingers on his left hand had gone the wrong color. The white yellow of frostbite, the skin waxy without sensation. She cleaned the affected tissue carefully, rewrapped it in layers that would restore circulation without shocking the damaged cells, tested the feeling at the margins of the injury with the clinical precision of someone who needed accurate information more than she needed to spare anyone discomfort. While Agnes worked, Doyle spoke to her hands rather than to Wren's face. His voice was the voice of a man who had been through something that had stripped it down to its essential frequencies. The farm didn't survive the storm. Each sentence arrived separately, as though he were testing the structural integrity of each one before committing to the next. Roof gave on the 3rd day. I was in the barn when it went. A pause that held the information that the barn had not been adequate replacement for the house. I had nowhere else to go. That last sentence landed in the warm air of the chamber with everything in it. The admission of solitude, the admission of error. The admission that the calculation he had made in November had produced results he had not anticipated. The admission that the only person in his world who might have taken him in was the person he had decided the world could take care of. He was not asking for forgiveness. He may not have understood that forgiveness was a category available in this situation. He was simply stating the arithmetic of his position, the way a man states arithmetic when he has run out of other options. Wren went to the shelf. She took down her mother's journal. The cloth-covered notebook she had carried from the farm had not opened until her first night in the chamber, had placed back on the shelf that same night with the intention of returning to it when she was ready. She carried it across the chamber to where Doyle sat beside the fire with Agnes's bandaging half finished and set it next to him on the stone. The last page. She said nothing else. She returned to the other side of the fire. His hand moved toward the journal and stopped. Moved again. He lifted the cover with the care of someone handling something fragile, which it was not physically, but in every other sense that applied. He turned through the pages slowly. The early ones she knew were the more legible ones, the handwriting her mother had possessed before the disease reached her hands, the careful penmanship of a woman who had been precise about things that could be made precise. Then the middle pages where the precision began its long negotiation with physical failure. Then the last pages where the letters grew and shook. He found the final entry. He read it. The chamber had the sounds of 22 people in a shared space, breathing the fire, the distant, constant pressure of the storm against the stone. No one was watching. Agnes had, with the particular social efficiency of a woman who managed difficult situations, through redirection, engaged the nearest cluster of people in a conversation about the storm's behavior that had continued with enough apparent spontaneity that no one had reason to doubt it was organic. Doyle closed his eyes. A tear moved down the side of his face, one following the line of his jaw, cutting a clean track through the grime that 7 days of exposure had deposited. He did not make a sound around it. He simply sat with the journal open in his lap and his eyes closed, and the single tear completing its path, and whatever he was doing with the weight of that page, he did it without asking anyone to witness it. Wren sat on her side of the fire, close enough to have been aware of him, far enough that the distance said, "I am not sending you away. I am not pretending this is resolved. This is where I am. You may stay on your side of this." They stayed that way through most of the night. 2 people sharing the same silence with the same fire between them and the same dead woman behind everything that had passed between them in the years since she was gone. There was no resolution. There was not meant to be resolution. Resolution was a word for problems that had conclusions, not for the kind of long human failure that accumulated through years of inadequate presence and departed without ceremony. What there was instead was the simple fact of both of them being in the same room, neither fleeing it, neither pretending the room contained only one of them. At some point before dawn, Doyle read the journal from the beginning. She could tell by the way his hands moved through the pages forward this time, with attention, with the posture of someone receiving rather than searching. He read for several hours. She watched without watching, the way you monitor something at the edge of peripheral vision, aware without directing attention there. When he finished, he closed the journal and set it on the stone beside him. He looked at the fire. He looked at the south wall. He sat with whatever the reading had given him, which was between him and the woman who had written it. The storm ended on the morning of the 10th day. Wren felt it before she heard it. The pressure against the stone changed, or rather the absence of pressure became available to her senses, which had been calibrated to constant resistance for so long that its removal registered as a physical event. She was at the entrance before full wakefulness, the way she had been at the entrance for every signal that mattered, and when she pushed through the crack into the exterior canyon, she stopped. The world was white, not the aggressive white of the storm, not white as a force, not white as erasure, but white as aftermath, as the settled consequence of 10 days of continuous work, white as the thing that remained when everything temporary had been stripped away. The sky above the canyon walls was a blue that had no business being that color, sharp and high and clean, the kind of blue that followed storms in the mountains when the air had been scoured of everything that usually softened it. Snow covered the canyon floor in drifts that had their own geography, valleys between peak surfaces, wine polished to a fine glaze, areas where accumulation had compressed into a density that would still be present in April. The stream was invisible beneath it. The canyon walls were a white coating that transformed familiar surfaces into things that needed relearning. She stood in the cold, bright morning and looked at it, and felt something she had not felt in 10 days. The specific quality of stillness that was not the storm resting between efforts, but the storm genuinely finished with what it had come to do. Smoke rose from the valley below. Multiple columns, thin and pale, the evidence of structures that had kept their integrity through everything the storm had offered, of fires that had been kept alive, of people who had survived by the various means available to them. People began leaving through the morning. They collected their blankets, gathered their children, oriented themselves toward the exterior canyon with the particular demeanor of people who have been inside something together long enough to have changed, in the being inside it, emerging now into a world that looked different than the one they had left, but was in fact the same world, slightly altered by 10 days of weather. Ezra Holt stopped before Wren on his way out. He extended his right hand. The handshake he offered had in it everything. He was not going to say the weight of what Mabel's survival meant, the weight of what he had witnessed over 10 days, the weight of a man who had spent his life communicating through the things his hands made and was now communicating through the hand itself. She held the shake for a moment. Mabel, steadier now, breathing clear, stood beside him and pulled Wren into an embrace that lasted exactly long enough to carry the meaning it needed to carry. Then they walked down the canyon trail together. Ezra's hand at Mabel's arm on the ice surface, 72 years old, and moving carefully, and moving, which was more than the storm had wanted for them. A girl, perhaps 7, from the family that had arrived on the storm's second day, stopped at the entrance before following her parents. She held out a piece of brown wrapping paper, folded and creased. Drawn on it in charcoal taken from the fire pit, a mountain simplified, its peak a triangle, its bulk a shape that conveyed mass without pretending to accuracy. Inside the mountain, rendered with the serious economy of a child who drew what she meant without decoration. A small house, triangular roof, square walls, a chimney with a wavering line of smoke emerging from it. "That's your house," the girl said with the gravity of a child communicating an established fact. Wren took the drawing. "Thank you." The girl nodded, once satisfied that the information had been received correctly, then ran after her parents, her boots breaking through the surface crust of the snow with each step. Harv Stubbs left last among the main group. He stood at the entrance for longer than departure required, long enough that his standing there was itself a communication, the communication of a man who has something to say but has not yet found the architecture for it. His mouth opened. He looked at the canyon floor. He looked at the entrance. He looked at a point slightly to the left of Wren's face, which was as close to looking at her as his current internal capacity permitted. "I just wanted to say that I—" He stopped, looked at the floor again. Wren looked at him directly. "I know." He swallowed, nodded, walked out of the canyon with the posture of a man who has been relieved of something he had been carrying and is still adjusting to the change in weight. Doyle left after Harv. He had been quiet through the morning's departures, not the withdrawn quiet of someone absent from the room, but the present quiet of someone watching something he wanted to see clearly while it was still available to be seen. He watched Ren with the people who were leaving. He watched how she moved through the room, how she received each departure, how she functioned in a space she had built from nothing while the people in it needed it to hold. Before he stepped through the entrance crack, he picked up the journal from the shelf where Ren had returned it the previous night. He held it with both hands, not to take it, she understood, but to hold it for a moment while he found what he needed to say. Your mother would have been proud of you. His voice was rough with the residue of everything the past 10 days had cost him, but it was steady. I think I know what she was going to write. The chamber was quiet. The fire had burned to a low, steady coal that cast a warm and patient light across the stone. The most important thing I want you to remember, Doyle said, and paused with the pause of a man measuring his confidence in what he was about to say, is that you do not need anyone's permission to be strong. He placed the journal back on the shelf. He looked at Ren for a moment with the direct gaze he had been unable to manage at the kitchen table in November, the direct gaze of a man who is too late to undo the thing he did, but is not going to refuse the reckoning. Then he turned and went through the entrance crack, and his footsteps moved away down the canyon, and the sound of them faded into the snow-muffled quiet of the aftermath. Ren stood alone in the chamber. She took the journal from the shelf. She opened it to the last page. She looked at her mother's final sentence, the letters that had grown large with effort, the ink that had pressed harder as the hand weakened the words that stopped mid-thought in the place where time had run out. She took a piece of charcoal from the edge of the fire ring. She pressed the tip of it to the page where the sentence stopped. She wrote in her own hand, steady where her mother's had shaken, present where her mother's had been interrupted, that you do not need anyone's permission to be strong. She closed the journal. She placed it back on the shelf beside SC's notebook. One cloth-covered, one leather-bound, two objects that had come from people who were gone, both of them now complete, both finished by the person who had remained when the person who started them could not. Spring arrived the way it arrived after hard winters, reluctantly at first, then with a sudden commitment that made the reluctance seem like preparation. Snow retreated from Cold Rock Canyon in stages over the weeks that followed the stream emerging from its shell of ice and running loud over the polished stones. Grass returned to the valley floor in patches that spread with the dailiness of a decision being confirmed. Birds appeared. The air lost its killing quality and became merely cold, then merely cool, then something that people called comfortable with genuine accuracy rather than optimistic exaggeration. Visitors came to the canyon, not the frightened, desperate visitors of December, but the curious visitors of a world returning to its normal pace. People who wanted to see the place they had heard about the place. Some of them had been in the place that had existed against all reasonable expectation during the worst storm in living memory. They stood inside the chamber and felt the warmth in the walls and tried to reconcile the stone's behavior with what they thought they knew about stone. They ran their palms across the surface the way Ren had done on her first day, reading what it communicated, arriving eventually at the same quiet understanding. Rutherford Crane came in the full brightness of a May afternoon alone. No horse, no man beside him carrying the implicit threat of sidearms. He walked into the canyon on his own feet, which was itself a different kind of communication than anything he had managed in December. The communication of a man who has recalculated his position relative to a specific situation and has arrived at different conclusions than his previous visit had supported. He looked older than winter. Not physically older, the winter had not consumed any portion of him that showed. What had aged was the quality of certainty he projected, which had previously been so consistent as to be invisible, a background condition rather than a characteristic. It was visible now in its diminishment, the way bones become visible when the flesh changes. His offer was financial. He named a figure that would have been meaningful in any context, meaningful enough to start somewhere new, to purchase land, to establish a life with foundations that didn't depend on geological accident. In exchange for that figure, she would leave Cold Rock Canyon permanently and would not speak of the notebook's contents, not to Cal Decker's reporting network, not to the territorial press, not to the various people who had spent time inside the chamber and were now available as witnesses to whatever questions she might choose to raise. Ren looked at him for a moment. You can't purchase something that kept people alive. Her voice was level without heat, not because she felt no heat, but because the situation was better served by clarity than by temperature. Crane's composure developed a fracture, not dramatic, barely visible. But she was watching closely, and she had spent years reading faces under conditions that required accuracy, and she saw it, the controlled release of something that had been held tightly for too long, a micro collapse at the margins of the certainty that had served as his public face. Who do you think you are? The question arrived with more force than he intended, which told her the force was real rather than strategic. A child who was thrown out of her own home. No money, no name, no legal standing of any kind. Living in a hole in the ground. And you think you can stand against me? Ren reached to the shelf without breaking eye contact. She lifted the leather-bound notebook and held it so he could see it clearly. The cover. The initials on the first page visible at this distance to anyone who had reason to know what they were looking at. Solomon Cross. She said the name at normal volume in the tone of a person reading from a record. He lived in this chamber for several years, approximately 30 years ago. He found mineral deposits in the eastern wall of this canyon and kept the information private because he loved the place more than he wanted what the discovery might generate. Then a man named M came to him with an order. Not a request, an order, and a man referred to only as G had arranged the order because G's family wanted this land unoccupied by anyone who could complicate their claim. Crane said nothing. His jaw held the tension of controlled response. Solomon Cross disappeared that winter. No body, no investigation, no questions asked because in this territory, in that era, the right name made questions optional. She held the notebook steady in both hands. I don't know what happened to him. Maybe he left voluntarily. Maybe the alternative was made clear enough that leaving felt like survival. Maybe it wasn't. She paused. What I know is that Cal Decker submits reports to 3 territorial publications. What I know is that a story about a man who disappeared from land that a family subsequently claimed in the same season, that family's fortunes changed permanently. That is the specific kind of story that territorial readers spend their winters on. It doesn't require proof. It requires only the question. Rutherford Crane stood in the spring sunlight of Cold Rock Canyon with the notebook visible between them and performed the calculation she had watched him perform in the second before every response he had made since December. The calculation of a man who had inherited a way of operating in the world and was now determining whether that inheritance still paid what it had historically paid. The calculation produced a different result than it had in December. He turned. He walked out of the canyon without looking back, without the declaration of a final word, without the gesture of a man who would return to resolve what he was leaving unresolved. He simply left. In the specific language of men like Rutherford Crane, that departure was its own answer. Complete, irreversible, communicated through the direction of his walking, rather than through anything his mouth had been willing to produce. He never formally withdrew his family's claim on Cold Rock Canyon. He simply stopped enforcing it, stopped mentioning it, stopped treating it as a fact that required defending. In the territory's unofficial economy of understood things, this was equivalent to surrender without the inconvenience of having to say so. Jeb Morrow did not return to his cabin after the snow melted. He built a lean-to at the mouth of the canyon. Substantial properly framed the work of a man constructing something he intended to use through seasons rather than merely through weeks. He said the trapping grounds in the canyon's upper reaches were better than his previous circuit, which was partially true. He said the position was more sheltered from the prevailing winter wind, which was also partially true. He appeared at the chamber each morning with whatever the day had produced: fish from the freed stream, game from the restored trap lines, occasionally nothing except himself, which proved over time to be sufficient justification on its own. He rehung the shelf bracket that had gradually pulled from the stone through repeated loading. He replaced the birch bark underlining the sleeping platform with fresh material because the old bark had done its job through the winter. He reinforced the entrance timber supports with new beams cut to better specification than the emergency installation on the storm's 8th night. He never mentioned his daughter again. He didn't need to. Everything he had been unable to say to the girl he had lost, he said through the consistency of his presence to the girl he had found, not as replacement, not as substitution, but as the simple fact of a man who had stopped running from the thing he wanted most, because the thing he wanted most had, through an improbable sequence of winter events, stopped moving. Agnes Pruitt kept her store in Ashburn. She did not change her personality, which was the personality of a woman who had survived enough to know that softness was a choice made in specific contexts rather than a general operating mode. She remained sharp. She remained direct. She retained her comprehensive impatience with foolishness in all its forms. Each week, a package made its way up the canyon trail, delivered by whatever traveler was moving in that direction. The packages contained things selected with the judgment of a woman who communicated care through practical objects because other modes of communication had never come naturally to her. T. Books used their spines worn from previous reading, which made them better in Agnes's view because they had already proven they repaid the time. A length of fabric, honey in a sealed jar. Once a month, Wren walked to Ashburn and sat in the store for an hour. They did not have emotional conversations. They discussed weather patterns, supply conditions, the health status of valley residents, the ongoing minor dramas of a small town in a territory still deciding what it was becoming. They drank tea. They occupied the same space without requiring the occupation to mean more than it was, which was exactly enough. It was the kind of friendship that gets built in the gaps between dramatic events, built through the repetition of ordinary proximity, through the Tuesday afternoon spent in a general store, when neither party has a pressing reason to be there, except that not being there would constitute an absence worth noticing. On an evening in the early autumn of the year that followed, Wren stood outside the chamber entrance and watched the last light work its way down the canyon walls. The stone caught the low sun in shades of amber and ochre that had nothing to do with their normal dark appearance, a daily event she had watched dozens of times since spring that continued to require attention. The stream ran clear between its polished banks. The air carried the first suggestion of the cold that would return the preview that mountains offered each year before the actual performance. Behind her, warmth drifted from the entrance crack. The same warmth, the same source far beneath the stone, the same geology that had been doing this since before there was anyone to notice it. Patient, constant, indifferent to the seasons, in the way that things indifferent to seasons could afford to be. She thought about those people who had laughed, about Crane on his gray horse with his certainty and his leather coat, about Agnes pushing money back across the counter in November, about Doyle at the kitchen table finding the specific angle of his hands that allowed him not to look at her face, about Ezra Holt standing in the dark offering to lift timber for a girl he had known for 7 days, about Harv Stubbs receiving a blanket with his eyes down, about Mabel breathing steam in the small hours while Agnes worked without stopping, about Cal Decker's expression when the story turned out to be true, about Jeb's hands adjusting her fingers on a piece of cord, the unconscious gesture of a man discovering that the muscle memory of teaching was still available to him, about her mother's sentence broken in the middle of its most important word, waiting for 20 months in a coat pocket until there was someone present to finish it. Being put out had felt like the final word. It had turned out to be the first word of a different sentence, one that she had been writing herself ever since, with every choice she had made in a canyon that had no business being warm in a chamber that had no business existing in a winter that had done everything possible to ensure that none of it could survive. It had survived. She had made it survive. Not through magic, not through luck, not through any force that had selected her or favored her or arranged things in her direction. Through the specific, repeatable, transferable skill of paying attention to small things that other people had decided were not worth attending to and following them when following them was the harder choice. The light completed its withdrawal from the canyon. Stars appeared above the walls, the particular density of stars available to people who live where light does not compete with them, where the sky is allowed to be what it is without interference. Wren went inside. Jeb was building the evening fire, his movements in the familiar rhythm of someone who has performed this particular sequence often enough to do it without directing attention to it. He looked up when he heard her enter, moved a few inches along his stone, created space that had not been there before. Nothing was said. The small shift of his body said what needed saying, that there was room here, that the room was being made deliberately, that the making of it was not a transaction, but a preference. Wren sat, not because she was cold, not because the fire or the warm stone required her presence. She sat because she wanted to be beside someone, rather than alone because she had spent enough months discovering the full dimensions of her own self-sufficiency to understand what it was not. Not a rejection of others, not a preference for isolation, but a foundation. The thing you built under the house so the house could stand, not the house itself. The fire caught. Light spread across the stone walls of the chamber. The same amber, the same steadiness, the same quality of warmth given without condition. On the shelf behind them, two notebooks rested where they had always rested since she had placed them there on separate days for separate reasons from separate losses. One cloth-covered, one leather-bound. Both finished now, both complete, not by the people who had started them, but by the people who had carried them forward into territory the original writers had not been given time to reach. Beside them, held flat by a smooth stone from the stream below the brown paper, drawing from a child's careful hand, a mountain, simple, unmistakable. Inside the mountain, visible through no windows, because mountains don't have windows, understood through no logic except the logic of the drawing itself, a house. Triangular roof, chimney. Smoke rising from the chimney in a wavering line, the way smoke rises when the air is still. The way it had risen every morning and every evening since the first fire Wren had built in a stone ring on a chamber floor in December. A house that should not have existed. A house that no one had believed in until the believing was replaced by being inside it. A house that held against everything the winter had brought, not because it was invincible, but because it had been built with genuine attention by someone who had learned that attention applied consistently to the things that mattered was the closest thing to invincibility available in this world. The smoke rose, the fire held, the mountain kept its warmth.